All right, and recording's up. So welcome to week 7, day 1, the first day of the second module on web development. So we're going to take a little detour from some of the algorithmic stuff that we've been talking about with Python and JavaScript, and instead go to the very basics of web programming. So tonight we're just gonna be a 101 for or basically web pages 101. Um, web pages are formed from three main things. You have HTML code, CSS code, and JavaScript. So HTML, or hypertext markup language, basically tells your browser how to display a web page. So for example, HTML, if you go to google.com, HTML is what tells Google, hey, display the Google image, display the search bar, display the little search button that you can press. CSS, or cascading style sheets, is the styling. So that basically says, hey, Chrome or Edge or whatever browser you use, though I hope it's not Edge, make the background of this web page white, make the text blue, and so on and so forth. And then JavaScript, which you guys have already had some experience with coding, is the thing that makes websites interactive. It's the part that says, hey, when I click the search box, run a query using this API that actually goes and searches the records. When I start typing, autocomplete my statements. So a web page, essentially, for our purposes right now, has those three main components. The HTML that says, here are the things that I'm putting on this web page. The CSS that says, hey, let's make these look a little bit nice and pretty. And the JavaScript that says, hey, make those things on that web page actually do something. So yeah, HTML, it sort of separates the content of your web page from its presentation. Um, because HTML is designed at essentially putting things on a page, it's not exactly programming in the way that we think of a programming language or a scripting language. It's really just there to create stuff. So let's talk about what an HTML page looks like. So in HTML, everything is defined within tags. And tags are created using opening and closing brackets. So, or opening, or sorry, left and less than and greater than signs. They're they're all things that start on one part and end on the other. But less than and greater than signs. So everything in HTML is essentially nested containers or nested pieces of content. So whenever you define HTML web page, you always need to start it and end it with HTML. That tells your browser when you open the file, hey, this is a HTML web page. Within that, we can add a bunch of different things. We can add a body, which is basically the main part of your web page. We can add a header. And within our body, why don't we can also add a title.
I have a question. One
Yes,
more. Um, do you not have to define the doc type?
that is a good question. Um, Defining doc type is not explicitly necessary,
Okay.
though you should do it. But it's not always needed.
Okay.
So in general, if you're defining that it's a .html page in the file name and you're opening it with an HTML file type or with an HTML tag, that's almost equivalent to saying doc type HTML as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. The doc type is also sometimes good to have for redundancy purposes. Like if you just open this file up by accident, you can look at the top and say, oh, that's an HTML file because it says doc type HTML. However, yeah, you're doing the exact same thing with that HTML tag on top. So back over to the web page. So let's go ahead and we have our header and a body. And let's make the web page title, which is the little thing in the header, my first web page. And then in the body, we can type something like this is my first web page. All right, so we can save that. Now, remember what I said about HTML not being a scripting language? If I take a look on the top right, I do not have a run button anymore. And the reason for that is because, well, there's no code to run. HTML is not a code that is not a language that when you run it, it does something. So instead, what we have to do is go into our browser and oh dear, now I need to find where I put this file. Reveal in File Explorer. There we go. And see if Chrome will open this. There we go. All right, now let me switch to my Chrome browser. So if you open up the HTML file, because again, HTML is not a language, it's not a language, as I think someone, oh, was it Justin? I think it was Justin, put in the chat. If you open it, again, we are not running an HTML file, you should see something pretty similar to this. For those following along, is everyone at roughly this point? All right, I'm assuming people are following along, but if not, that's okay. So there's a couple of things to notice. So, ooh, I can split screen. Let's go share my full screen. There we go. Okay, there's a couple of things to notice. Number one is that thing that I put in title and slash title, that is over at the top. It's the title of the web page. And then all of this stuff that I put in my body is what actually shows up on the HTML page. So we can also, if you take a look in here, the area where I am right now, the body, is nested within the HTML tags. So we can make even more essentially sublayers of content. So we have this body with the generic Times New Roman 12-point font of this is my first web page. But let's say that we wanted to, give somebody a really nice warm welcome to our web page. Well, we can add an H1 tag and we can say hello, welcome, or something like that. Now, what this does is, as you see on the top, it's the H1 element is nested within the body, which is nested within our overall HTML page. Additionally, this H1 tag is located below this. This is my first web page. So we should see this hello welcome thing below this is for my first web page. And indeed we do. Now, there's one kind of critical difference. Why might this text be bold and large, whereas the text above it is not?
Because it's an H1 tag.
It's because of the H1 tag, exactly. So there's multiple different layers of H tags or header head tags. We have, I think, yeah, 6 of them. And it basically goes from biggest to smallest, where all of those are bold and some amount of large headings. So something like this, where we have H1 and then close H1 and something inside it, is known as an element in HTML. So and every single element has content. So what you could say is that the body element has content within it, has normal text, and then it also has this H1 element. And the H1 element has the content of hello and welcome. So we can also nest elements within each other. So we already are kind of seeing that with the body. Here, let me close that. So we've nested the H1 element within the body element, within the HTML element. And we can go and make this even more complicated as time goes on. However, that's not explicitly necessary. Now, what I'd like us to do is if you right click any web page and you hit inspect, here we'll zoom out a little bit, you can see that our web page is broken up into visually into different boxes. And each element on an HTML web page is represented by a box. So, except the header. So, everything within the body is represented with a box. The body itself, as you can see when I mouse over it, is represented by a giant box. This is my first web page part is a text element, as you can see by the hashtag text. That's represented by a small box of width 246.27. I believe that's pixels and height of 26 pixels. And then the H1 tag is represented by a box with those dimensions as you see written out on the screen. So there's also there's different types of elements. So in addition to your tags like H1, you've got a bold tag, you have an italicized tag, you have an underline tag, and we can refresh the page and see those. We have bold, italic, and underline, as represented by what I just wrote on the left. One thing to keep in mind, though, is if we take a look at bold, italic, and underline, all of those are on the same line. But in my code, I just put returns between them. These are all on separate lines in my code, but they're all on the same line in my HTML web page. And there's a reason for that. And that's because these are called inline elements. So inline elements are ones that, like bold, italic, underline, the A tag, which is for linking, etc. They only take up the space of their content. And we can see that if we mouse over bold, that the bold tag only takes up the space of its bold, B-O-L-D, the words. In contrast, the H1 tag is a block element, where it takes up the entire width of its parent. And in this case, the parent is the body tag. So let's say that we wanted to put the bold, italic, and underline tags on separate lines. How can we do that? Well, there's a couple of ways. The easiest way is to add in a break return, which is just said by using BR. And if you add a BR, that will automatically tell HTML, hey, put this and the thing after it on separate lines, as you can see as we've done here. Now, BRs are not elements that have content in them. And you can see that because it says that the BR is a 0 by 0 box. It doesn't take up space. What it does do is it puts things on the next line. So that is method one. The second method is to put things in divs. So let's try that. So let's make a div and we can say this is a div. Save that and we'll hit run. So what is a div, very briefly? Div, which stands for division or divider or some divide something, which I've currently forgotten, it creates a block element. So again, that stretches all the way across the page, and separates things in that block from other things above it. So where are divs useful? Think about divs somewhat similarly to breaking up your code. So for example, if you have like 1,000 lines of code in Python, you don't necessarily want to put it all 1,000 lines, together. Maybe let's say the first 200 lines are a file import function. The next 400 lines are data cleanup. And the last 400 lines are your output. So instead of, combining all that in one giant file with no breaks between, you might very well put some comments that say, hey, the first section of this code is A, B, C, D. The next section of this code is X, Y, Z, and so on and so forth. That's kind of like what divs do in HTML. So what you can do is you can define a div here that contains, let's say, this div is going to contain your welcome message, and then the next div is going to contain everything outside of your welcome message. So if we hit return, we now see in that code on the right in the inspect window that our code has been summarized into two divs. The first div, the div on top, contains this is my first web page and hello, welcome. And if we mouse over that div, we see that takes up all the space of its child elements. The next div contains the stuff that we put inside it, which is that bold, italic, underline. And if we go into it, we see it does indeed contain bold, italic, and underline, the text that we told it to. So divs are useful for breaking up content like that. All right, let me pause for a second. Are there any questions about the HTML elements, about block versus inline, about what divs are and maybe why we use them?
Block and inline were the only two terms you used to describe the amount of space they take up. Is that right? Did I understand that right?
So in general, those are the two types of elements that exist. Like at the highest level for HTML is you have your block elements that take up the entire width of their parent, and you have your inline elements which only take up as much space as their children. Or as their content, whichever one. So in general, you always want your block element. So if you're writing something that is nesting a bunch of inline and block elements, in general, you want your block elements to be outside of the inline elements. So for example, if I wanted to create a new div that had some italicized text in it. This text is italicized and in a div. This is the proper way to do it, where I have the block tag first, and then the inline stuff inside that. Because the inline is restricted to how large the parent is. The wrong way to do that is to do the italics first, and then the div after. You say this is a new div. And if you take a look, I mean, sure, it's still stretching all the way across the page, but the point is that you're, in general, should not nest a block element within an inline one. So don't do the latter, do the former. Okay, so that's the basics of HTML. You have your tags that house content in them. You have your two types of tags / elements, which are block and inline. And you always want to, in general, it's good practice to put your inline elements inside of your blocks. All right, so let's talk a little bit about CSS, or cascading style sheets. So as you guys can see, this web page is extremely boring. It looks like something straight out of like 2005. And we don't want our web pages to look this way, because that is not style. So introducing cascading style sheets, which basically allows you to customize your HTML output to make it look nice. So for example, let's say that I wanted to, let's say that I wanted to make the text red, but maybe not across the entire page, maybe on some of it. So let's say that I wanted to make the welcome text bright red. So what we can do is we can say style, because again, CSS is cascading style sheets. And we'll say style is going to be color and then colon. And you see here we have a bunch of different options for color. Let's just go with a nice simple red. And hit a semicolon. And we're going to hit refresh and look at that. Our text is now successfully changed from black to red. So first off, what does this syntax look like?
CSS?
It is CSS, but thinking about non-HTML and CSS,
Oh, I'm a dictionary?
it is a dictionary, exactly. So at its core, CSS is a bunch of dictionaries. That's essentially how web pages are styled. Whether it's specifying color, specifying size, specifying font, specifying, we can go on. We can say like font family, or here, let's actually see. Let's see, font style. We can make this oblique. We can keep going. But the important thing to know is CSS is a set of key value pairs, which that sounds like a dictionary, and effectively it is. So there's two ways that we can write CSS. One way is by doing it inline or in every single element that we want to apply CSS to. So for example, let's say we want to make the H1 tag be red, and let's say we want to make this italic. Let's say I want to make this italic text blue. We'll refresh that, and now if we take a look, that italicized text is indeed blue, and the text in that H1 tag is red. But let's be honest, it's going to look really ugly if we just applied the style to and hand wrote this in to every single place we wanted to make changes. We do not want to do that. So there is a nice option for us. We can create a dedicated style sheet page. So let's do that. So let's create a style sheet. We'll say week 7, day 1 .css, and that actually gets created. Oh, I should probably catch up on the chat. And also, if you guys have questions, feel free to ask. Justin, that is a good question. How do you center a div? There are many methods to center divs, none of which, well, okay, I guess one of which we can discuss tonight. And we'll get into more complicated divs, or more complicated methods to manipulate divs over the next few days. But the easiest one is to align your div. And I think Kim mentioned that down below. So for people who want to align your divs, you can align them to the center, to the right, or to the left. There's also vertical alignment that we can do too, but not necessary right now. Any other questions before we move on to how to make a CSS style sheet? So remember that CSS, oh dear. Okay, there we go. Yes, Flexbox is a pain. It's a good thing that you guys will be learning, or perhaps for some of you, relearning Flexbox in this class. We will not be making it less of a pain, unfortunately. I don't think anyone really can. But perhaps the reintroduction of it may prove insightful. But thankfully, we're not doing that tonight. So CSS, or cascading style sheets, is a way to turn this inline style here into something that looks a little bit nicer. Now, before we go into CSS more fully, there's three ways that CSS can apply to to elements. And there's three, I guess, types of elements that we can talk about. There's, broadly speaking, the type of tag, like a div or an h1 or a bold tag. Then there's a class, which we can define, and then an ID, which is the most specific thing. So, for example, we could say that this div has a class that, and we are defining these terms. A class is kind of like a family. So you could say this is just going to be like the class of this div is like body div. And then we can say that it has an ID, which is body div 2. Now, sort of like you could think about classes and IDs kind of like classes in Python, but an ID is a variable. So you can have multiple different objects or multiple different elements be of the same class, right? So we can, for example, this div down below, we can also call it, oops, lowercase, class. We can also say that this is in the body div class, but I cannot say that its ID is body div 2 as well. If I were to do that, then I would get an error. Or maybe not an error directly, but it would be like, hey, there is a problem. Because you can't have two elements that have the exact same ID. So instead, what we'll need to do is change it from body div 2 to body div 1 or 3 or something else. Let's change that briefly now. So we can apply a style to a overall type of tag. We can apply it to a class of tag or to a specific ID. So let's examine how we can do that. So let's forget some of those styles for now, and we'll go back to them. The first thing that we should probably do is link our HTML document to our style sheet. So we define our style sheet here that we have not linked over to it yet. The way that we can link a style sheet to our HTML page is by using the link tag, which is oddly convenient. So we're going to say that the link is relating to a style sheet whose type is text, and it is text CSS. And the location of this is going to be in week 7, day 1.css. And we'll have it close on itself. We've now just set the styling of our web page to be the styling inside of week 7, day 1.css. So if I refresh the page, there's absolutely nothing in this blank CSS document. So what do you guys think will happen to the website on the right if I just refresh the page?
Say no change because there's nothing to read from.
Your text is going to go back to just straight black text, probably.
Yep, yeah, so Jonathan, you got it. Because we removed all of the
Oh, that's
style
right.
equals. If we didn't remove the style equals, then Sean, you would be right.
Yeah, I
because
didn't see you remove all that stuff. I was distracted. My bad.
No, you're good. Yeah, but because we removed those, we're going back to having no styling at all. So if I hit enter, it goes back to boring old text as it was before. So let's change that. So we can do a couple things. Let's start off with that H1 tag. So what I would like to do is change that H1 tag from just being boring black H1 to specifying that its color is going to be, let's pick a non-boring color this time. Uh, Dodger blue. That looks like a cool color. And again, we have our little dictionary format. Let's see if we can add in an other attribute. Also, you can, if you just scroll through here, you can see how many different attributes exist. And that's just attributes that have an A in it. If I type another letter like B, um, we get even more. So there are literally hundreds, if not probably thousands of attributes that we can play with in CSS. I do not encourage that you go down the rabbit hole of trying to learn and memorize each one, but there are some that are important. Like for example, background color is usually an important one that specifies the background color of your div. So if I were to say, for example, the background color of the div is going to be black, and we go ahead and inspect the element of that H1 tag, let's open it up. What we should see is that the text now changes to Dodger blue, and then the entire thing that's blue and highlighted should change to black, because that's what we specified as the background color. And we see that that is indeed the case. So if you want to see if an element is inline or a block element, number one, mousing over it in that inspect element view can show you exactly how much space it takes up. But also, so does just setting the background color of the element. It's an underrated tool, in my opinion. So, all right, we specified what it is for the H1 tag. Let's go ahead and mess with our divs a little bit as well. So let's say that our div, we want it to be, let's make them all small caps. I'm actually not sure what that does, but if we do that, oh, fun. It now changes all of the font to be small capital letters in all of our divs. But let's say I don't want that in every single div, right? Let's say I only want that small caps. I don't want that to apply to my H1 tag. I only want it to apply to my second two divs, which both have the body div class. Well, what I can do is I can specify that I only want it to apply to the body div class. And now, this will specifically apply to things with the, oh, sorry, I think that's supposed to be a dash, or sorry, a period. There we go. Now this will only apply to things whose class is body div. So if we go back, now that should not apply to the first div because its class is not body div. It doesn't have a class, but it should apply to the next class and the class after it. I'll hit enter. And that decided not to work. What if we just do this? There we go. It was because I had the div out front. So when you put the dot and the name of the class, it'll automatically apply to that class. So what we could do again is we can say, let's say that we wanted to have for all of our divs, we want the let's say that we want the border color to be blue. And we'll hit fresh. Okay, that actually didn't do anything. Now let's change the text color to be blue for all the divs. So now the text is blue in all our divs. However, our body div has overridden the property of our regular div. For our regular div, we didn't specify a font variant. So if we look all the way at the top, where that this is my first web page, that was in a normal div. So its text is blue. However, because we specified the class for this div and the last div is this body div class, and we said that the font variant is going to be small caps, then this sort of overrides that. So class CSS overrides overall tag CSS. Now, if we can see that even more strikingly, if we specify that the color here is now going to change from blue to, what's an easy to read color? Green. And we hit refresh, and we see in that body div class, we've now overridden directly a property of, here we said all divs have to have blue text. But in our body div class, we're specifying, no, that's not the case. The body div class, even if it is a div, needs to have the green color. And we can get one more level granular than that. Here, again, we have our two divs. We have body div 2 and then body div 3. Let's say that in my body div 3, which is that italicized text, I wanted that div to have a background color of, I don't know, gray. So we can specify that too by going to the ID. So remember that IDs, as it says here, are unique. So what I can do is I can say hashtag body div 3, and I can specify a background color for it that is gray. So what this will do is, and just for kicks, we might as well override something else. So we can say that the text color is going to be brown. So before we refresh the web page, let's talk about what's happening in this last div. So this last div is a div, so its font color should be blue, but it's also of class body div. So it's going to be in small caps, and its color is now overridden from blue to green. But I also just said that its ID is body div 3. So its color should now be overridden again from green to now being brown, and its background color should now be gray. So if I refresh this, we see that indeed we get a very ugly div with brownish red text and a gray background. The point of this exercise in grotesque looking CSS is to talk about the hierarchy of style that HTML has. HTML and CSS assign weight depending on the type of thing you're applying the style to. So the highest weight is assigned to style that is applied to an ID, which is done by using the hashtag. The second highest weight is done by modifying a class, which is done using the dot. And then the last highest is modifying an overall type of element, like a div. So which one takes priority? It's going to be the ID takes priority first, the class second, and the type of object third. And yes, this is called specificity. Any questions about that? Okay. Oh, I forgot to mention, there is one other way to define CSS for your web page too. So we talked about how you can define CSS inline by saying like style equals and defining it in here. We talked about how we can import a style sheet by linking to it using a link tag and creating a .css page. You can also just write CSS directly into your HTML document using style and close style. And what goes inside here is going to basically be your CSS page, your CSS document copy pasted can go in there. So all three of those, whether doing inline CSS to modify an individual element, linking to a style sheet to modify your elements however you choose, or adding style close style in the header of your HTML document are all equally accepted. So we're going to talk about one last thing for lecture, which is related to making boxes. Now, this is something that we're only going to talk about in a little bit of detail tonight because boxes may be the bane of your existence. If not in this module, definitely in about the next month and a half. So I wouldn't want to take that away from you too early. But we're going to talk about why boxes are so useful. So going back to what we were talking about probably at the beginning of this lecture, we talked about inline elements and block elements. Everything in HTML is some sort of a block. Take a look at that body. The overall web page is a box. And we can see its description down at the bottom right that I can't zoom into. But if you take a look at the bottom right of my screen, it says that our web page has a 8-pixel margin. It doesn't have a border. It doesn't have it doesn't have any padding. And then it has this middle part that is 371 pixels wide by 614 pixels tall. Within that, our first div at the top does not have a margin. It doesn't have any borders, doesn't have any padding, but it is 371 pixels wide and 76 pixels tall. We can do the same thing with the second div and our tiny third div. Everything in HTML is a box. And learning how to modify boxes is generally something good to do. If you can modify a box, you can make sure that it fits the content you need to, or you can determine if something is way too oversized to be on your web page. So the way that we modify boxes in general is through modifying your div. So let's take a look and here, let's just make a new div and we'll call this div. Let's say class is going to be like box 1 and we'll just say I am a box. So right now, if we refresh it and we look at I am a box, we see that our box has some dimensions, right? It's 18 pixels tall and stretches all the way across the page. But that's not really, we don't know how to customize that box. So let's do that in our lovely little CSS. So we can modify that box class by saying we're going to do dot, because dot is what modifies our class, dot box1. And there's a couple of things we can do. So if we take a look again down at the bottom right of the screen, we have five main attributes for every single box or every single element in HTML. You have a margin, you have a border, you have padding, and we have width, and height. There are more options than this, but we won't get into those now. Trust me when I say there's a lot. But the first one is going to be the margin. So if we take a look at that body tag, the margin is essentially the amount of distance between the parent element and the start of yours. So let's say that we're going to specify that we want a 20 pixel margin. Also, you need to specify your units whenever you're dealing with defining the characters of a box. In this case, the best type, there's two main units that people will use, pixels and percentage. For right now, we'll use pixels, but percentage is also an acceptable option, where percentage is the percentage of your total screen width or height. Now, let's say that we're going to specify that we want to have a 20 pixel margin. So what does that look like? we take a look down at our new div now, we see that it's staggered by 20 pixels from the top, bottom, left, and right between the parent element and the content inside that div. So let's add on a border. So the border separates the margin from the content with padding. Now let's say that we want to add a 5-pixel border and we want it to be a dashed border. We can make it solid or dashed, or I believe there's others, but we'll stick to dashed and solid for now. And we'll specify that we want this border to be Rebecca purple. So if I refresh this now, and we take a look at our div, we see that we have our 20-pixel margin, which is that orange thing. Then we have our dashed border, which is this little purple dash. And then inside of that, we have our content. But we're not done yet, because we can also add padding. And padding separates the border from the content. And let's say that we are going to add in let's make it 10 pixels of padding. So we'll hit refresh one more time. And if we take a look, again, we now see that our box has multiple parts. You have, again, your margin, you have the border, and then we have that greenish thing on the inside that hopefully you can see. I'll zoom in a little bit, which is the padding, and then the blue part, which is the actual content. Now, we can also modify the height. Finally, we can modify the width and height of the content. So let's say that we're going to specify the height is going to be, let's make it 100 pixels, and we're going to make the width equal to like 500 pixels. And we'll hit refresh. And now if we take a look at the box that we created, we see that the overall size of the content part, which is that middle, is 500 by 100. And then we add to that our padding, we add our border, and we add our margin, and then that's how we get this massive behemoth of a div box. And that's all through the magic of adding those parameters through CSS. Now we can, again, just like we talked about, every single tag in HTML does something with the box. Whether it's inline and it makes a box in its own little confined space, or it's a block element and it takes up as much room as it can. Everything is a box. So knowing how to make and how to modify boxes using CSS and classes and IDs is extremely useful. Any questions about our HTML 101?
I really appreciate how you explained all the margins and padding and all of that. That was very clear.
Glad to hear it. And Kim, just to make sure that it is, would you like to participate in a pop quiz?
I can participate, can't promise I'll be right.
Well, participation is what matters. So first off, you mentioned margins and padding. What are margins and padding?
They determine how much space there is between different places, depending on which one you're talking about.
So are margins and padding the same thing?
They are not the same thing. They work similar, but they're not the same location.
Yep, perfect. So that is one thing that a lot of people get wrong, is they will confuse margins and padding. Padding is always within a margin. So your margin separates the parent from everything inside it, and the padding separates your content from everything outside that. So if we go back to that little layered view, okay, it does not want to play nicely, but let's try it one more time. If we go back to the view that showed up for like a split second there, and I don't know why it does not want to show me the nice expect tab, but that's okay. The margin was that orange thing on the outside, and the padding was the green thing on the inside. But yes, that was a good answer. So thank you, Kim. Um, let's see. So Sean, I'm gonna encourage you to answer this question. Um, where do you center the content?
Within the
Where would
box
that
that you
go?
created.
So would that go, where would that go in say the CSS?
It would go in your box, your class, right? That
Yep.
was a class. Yeah, docs class.
Yeah. So let's try that and see what happens. And if you take a look, indeed, our text does get centered. But no, it only gets centered
That's
horizontally.
weird. I put mine at the top and it centered it in the very center of my box. And I have the exact same stuff you have.
Are you sure you have the exact same thing?
Text align, center, margin 20, border 5, padding. I mean, everything in the class is the same. I don't know. I didn't add any other extra classes. I mean, let me look at my div. My div is just a background color.
Did you
And
add
CSS.
a line tag anywhere?
I mean, it's text align center. We're not anywhere else within the CSS.
Interesting. The other possibility is because our screens are differently sized, that it looks like it's in the center of yours.
Huh.
Increase the height a whole bunch.
My width. Width is 500, height is 100, padding. Yeah, it's all the same. I could share my screen just so we could see what I
Yeah,
did
go for it.
differently.
I would be interested to see that.
I know that was one of the questions that Justin had. How do you center the content or the div? Let's see here. Sure. So the way. Yeah, mine's in the center. And here's my ID. Oops. Or class.
Interesting, because yeah, so text align in CSS is only supposed to align horizontally. Otherwise, you want to use what Tisdale mentioned, which is align content.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I didn't that's why.
Yep.
I had that earlier and I didn't refresh it. That's why. Okay.
But yeah, that is a good catch. So thank you both for pointing that out. But yeah, align content is what you will use for vertical and horizontal centering, while text align is just for horizontal. All right, let's see. I'll ask one or two more pop quiz questions and then we'll jump off. Let's see, Daryl, can you run us through the difference between a block element and an inline element?
A block element will like cover the entire screen or the entire body. Then an inline element will only just cover the content, like the length of the content.
Yep. All right, perfect. Um, and one last simple question. Can you nest elements in HTML?
Yes.
Okay, that's about it for lecture. I think everyone's got the main idea. So we'll stop the recording